Hello, this is Todd from TT Bike Fit, and today we're going to look at some of the bike fit characteristics of the top pros at Kona this year. And we're going to start out with Andrew Starkowitz, first rider back. Everyone knows record holder for Ironman bike leg. Not necessarily known as the best runner in the world, but let's take a look at his position. And one thing I can say is that he's kind of in a category of his own as far as how he's positioned relative to the other riders. I'm going to put some lines on here and draw some angles, and we'll talk about what I mean. So relative to the camera, the bike is tipped down about 3 degrees or so. So we'll take that into account as we look at the angles. The first thing I want to look at is his effective seat angle. So we try to look at the approximate position of the sit bones relative to the bottom bracket. So in his case, we're getting a number around 79 right here, and we take that 3 out, and that puts him at an effective seat angle of about 76, maybe 77 degrees or so. That is much further back, or much slacker of a seat angle than we're going to see on all these other riders. And if there's one thing I really noticed this year, is that many of the riders are just sitting incredibly steep on their bikes. So by steep we mean very far forward relative to the bottom bracket. So what does that seat angle position, that effective seat angle position, do for the rider? Well, it affects the angle we see here. It affects the angle of the thigh at the top of the pedal stroke. It's at least one of the factors that affects that. So all things being equal, if we maintain the same distance to the bottom bracket and move the rider forward, his knee is not going to come up as high as he goes forward. And so we'll start to see this angle drop down, opening up the hip angle, the angle between the thigh and the torso here at the top of the pedal stroke. So opening that angle can make it easier for the rider to generate power. And if we look at Andrew's position with his relatively slack seat angle, again, let's put this at 77, remember the 3 degrees. His thigh angle here, I would give him a minus the 3 degrees, about 20 degrees. And that's about the minimum that we like to see if it can possibly be helped. Of course, another way to address this is with shorter cranks, and that is one of the topics that you're hearing a lot about today is shortening cranks, and we've done that with a number of riders to improve this angle in some cases. But so if we say that he's 20 degrees at the top of the pedal stroke here, that is a relatively tight hip angle because of the angle of his thigh, because he's sitting back. If he were to move further forward, that angle would open up some. So he is pushing more from behind compared to the other riders we're going to look at. That tends to activate the glute muscles more like a road bike position. The drawback to that can be that it affects your running. Andrew's not known as the best runner out there on the circuit, and perhaps this has something to do with it. If we look at his overall aero position, his torso angle, he's tipped down 3, so I'm getting about a 5 degree here. That puts him at 8. So that puts him on the for a elite level position toward the upper end. In other words, toward the more upright position as far as an elite position would be concerned. So he doesn't strike you as being the most aero guy out there, even if he is the fastest. And he actually, with this rearward seating position, his reach is actually fairly extended here. If we can see where his pads are, his upper arm is angled forward a good bit. His elbow is a good bit out in front of his shoulder. And he's still got a decent amount of elbow off the back edge of the pad. So, he's in a somewhat of a stretched out setup here with his rearward seating position. He chose to wear a Giro Attack helmet. He's got, as far as his head position is concerned, again, we're going to have to go with the minus 3 degrees here. He's got a decent amount of head up above his body here. And if this is, this is pretty much his typical head position, because I've looked at him at a couple other spots on the course, and this is pretty much what he looks like. So, he actually could have been a good candidate for a tailed helmet, but it might have been a heat decision to wear the attack versus a full tailed helmet. But with a right tailed helmet, you'd think he'd be able to seal it pretty well on his back with his head position. It's the riders who spend a lot of time looking down at their forearms that are going to benefit aerodynamically more from a bobtailed helmet like this. A couple other things we might want to look at, just at some fine points on the bike setup. He's using a single bottle holder behind the seat, tilted back, which we see a lot of the pros use. He's got a Tour hands on the front of the bike for hydration. Also has a Tour hands here on the frame, wedged into the triangle. Probably improves the aerodynamics of the bike. And notice the what looks like an FSA Metron rear derailleur here with the aero cage. If we look at his pedaling technique and his seat height, now we don't have a shot of him, directly from the side, but when I look at his knee angle, just eyeballing it, his saddle height and his knee angle looks pretty typical from what I can tell from this rearward angle, and you can see the other leg, through on the other side. It looks like he falls pretty much into the middle of the range there, and relative to a lot of riders, he's a little flatter through the bottom of the pedal stroke than we're going to see on some of these other riders. And just once again, to dispel the myth, you should not pedal with your foot flat at the bottom of the pedal stroke. Almost no elite rider does that, and he's certainly one of the flatter ones we're going to see. So an interesting comparison is between Andrew and Seb Keena. And so here is Seb. And of course, when you look at Seb, you immediately just think to yourself, boy, that guy looks aero. He looks fast on that bike. And there's no doubt about it. And there's definitely some comparisons we can make here to compare the differences between the two riders. Right away you'll see that I've got that 3-degree angle also here, tilted down approximately. I've got this 85 line on his sit bones, and so he's approximately minus that 3, sitting at 82 degrees versus that 76, 77 that we see on Starkowitz. You'll also notice this 2-degree line here. That's actually minus 2 degrees. So we put that 3 back, and it puts him, right at 1 degree, essentially dead horizontal. You could easily say that's 3 minus 3, so 0. So it pretty much puts him at a dead horizontal torso angle, and sitting, a lot more forward. And of course, you'll notice that, relative to the high point on his back, his head is very low. It's essentially lower than the high point on his back, and so all of that, his head is basically dropped into the gap there and between the arms, and all of that makes for an extremely aero position. It doesn't necessarily make for the most comfortable position from the standpoint of looking up the road. And you'll see the neutral head position for him is basically looking down at his wrists. And that's both, going to be for aerodynamic reasons and for the fact that that's just going to be the most comfortable position for him to hold his head. Now, there's some other things we can look at here, including that thigh angle we were talking about. So let's see if we can get him at the highest point. And now, he's a little bit in front of the camera, so the angle here is not going to be perfect. But if we look at it, I'm getting 32 minus that 3. That's about 29 degrees versus where we had about 20 here. So, a lot more open, and a lot of that's going to come from the fact that he's sitting at a much steeper seat angle than Starkowitz is. So, this is a trend we're going to see, as I said, that many of these guys are sitting very far forward, and that they get a pretty high angle here on this thigh to give them the ability to give them the hip angle range to get their torso low in aero and be able to generate power effectively. So we can do an overlay here to get another comparison between the two different positions. And what I've tried to do here is line up the chain ring on the two bikes. And when we morph the one position to the other, and I try to match the scale as good as possible, you can clearly see that we kind of have a back and rearward pushing from behind position versus the Keena forward on top of the more on top of the elbows type of position. Much lower head. And again, I would say, from what I can see without getting a perfect side view of Seb's knee angle here, looks pretty standard to me as far as saddle height, toward the middle of the range. If anything, maybe slightly higher. Pedaling technique, you'll notice, again, that there is a toe down through the bottom of the pedal stroke. Next, we're going to look at Luke McKenzie, who had a great race, rides the same bike as Keena, and has a position that's quite similar in many ways. He's not quite as low, and Luke uses a real toe down pedaling style. Always has in the years I've been looking at it. You can see, very vertical through the top of the pedal stroke on the heel, and even at the bottom of the pedal stroke we can see how much toe down, heel up he likes to use. But I think probably the most striking thing we're going to see about his position is just how steeply he is sitting. So you can see how far forward he is on his saddle here, and I'm going to try to get the approximate angle on the bike. Of course, the camera's angled a little bit, the bike's not perfectly square, but I'm going to call it 8 degrees tilted down in this case. So let's see where we get his sit bones. So once again, so this is 89 past 90, so we're looking at about probably 83 degrees roughly. And if we tilt, we can get a further look here, which puts it at 6. So again, it's 83, 84, even 85 degrees effective seat angle as far as where he's sitting. Obviously, move forward from what would be the normal sitting position on this saddle by probably 8 to 10 centimeters. And one of the interesting things about that much of a move forward on the saddle is that it's going to reduce the saddle height. So, the effective saddle height. So if a rider moves forward, a rider with an average saddle height moves forward, say 4 degrees from 76 to 80, that'd be about a roughly a 4 centimeter move forward, and it's going to effectively lower their saddle by 1 centimeter because they're getting closer to the bottom bracket. And if there's any tilt in the saddle, then it's going to lower it even more. So the conundrum in that case becomes, where do you set the saddle height for when the rider's going to be sitting very far forward here? If it's set properly there, then it's going to definitely be high on the high end when he's sitting back, if he ever does sit back very much. And it's going to be, or otherwise, if you set it properly for when the rider's sitting in a normal seating position, it's going to be low when he's way up here on the nose in the aero position. And I think that's the mistake that potentially a few riders made that we'll look at in the second video, where it looks like the saddle was set up, you know, for them to be sitting back, yet they're sitting very far forward. We can't really get a good thigh angle on Luke here because of where I was able to, you know, film him, and he was basically, I was kind of behind him with the camera a little bit here, so we aren't able to get that. But clearly, you know, he's getting this far forward to give himself some hip angle room, and especially with that very high heel over the top of the pedal stroke, that's going to effectively push his knee up further. So, you know, he's going to really need to get himself forward to get that open. You know, another thing we can look at, part of the difference in the shape you see, you know, in these two riders' torso has to do with pelvic tilt. So remember, he's tilted down, let's call it 6 right here. So that puts him, you know, close to 50 degrees. Whereas if we look at Seb here, he's tilted down 3. So maybe that puts him at 38. So he's rolled a lot further forward with his pelvis. Gives him a shallower spinal takeoff angle, and therefore he can get a flatter back in a lower position relative to, you know, more curvature and a bit of a higher position here with Luke, because he's got essentially a steeper spinal takeoff angle. And if you don't, you know, some riders are able to get very flat with a more upright pelvis if they can bend their lumbar spines quite a bit, but we don't see a lot of bend here. So, you know, there's a distinct difference you'll find from one rider to the next. You know, how much are they able to tilt their pelvis, and then, you know, how much flex are they able to get out of their spine comfortably, and where is it flexed, etc. And that will often determine, you know, where the front end of the bike needs to be, what's comfortable for them and what isn't comfortable for them. So in the next video, we're going to take a look at Frederick Van Lierde versus some of these riders. Of course, the winner of the Ironman this year, and we'll take a look at some setups that are a little bit questionable.